When buying an EQ, what should I look out for? So there's a few things to look out for when buying an EQ, and one of them, and not all EQs have this, is bypass. Now, bypass is cool. Every EQ has bypass to bypass the EQ. Not all EQs can bypass each band. For instance, the SPL PQ here, you can bypass each band, and that is really helpful for when you want to audition and see what you're doing, if it's actually making the difference that you want it to make. So you can just switch off the band rather than switching the whole of the EQ off. So you just you can kind of dial in what you want to do on that band and then audition it and see if that is what you want to achieve. Things like the Vertigo VSE, that's not got that. But that is only a 3-band EQ. Other things to look for with an EQ is dual mono. Now, dual mono, the reason I say this is because what you can then do is run it in mid-side. If you have just a stereo EQ with a single set of parameters that control left and right together, that's good. If you don't ever want to use it in kind of dual mono in mid-side. Now, that's cool because then technically speaking you have a link function where the left controls the right, so you've got one set of parameters. Generally, you'll see on most EQs a left and a right, and you'll independently control these. Now, if you're working in stereo and you are working left and right rather than mid and side, the left and right can be EQ'd differently, and that is good for when you're mastering as well. Most 99% of the time you are going to match left and right. But the good thing about dual mono is you have left and right, mid and side, so you can then switch it into mid side if you've got an encoder and decoder, and work with the left hand side, work the mid, and then the right hand side, work the sides, which is your width. Anything else that EQ wise, yeah, the one thing to look for with an EQ is, and this is one thing I will say, is cheap EQs. I always think this is cheap EQs. You can emulate a good amount of an EQ in the box. If you're going to buy a cheap EQ for, let's say, under $1,000, you may as well stay in the box. And that's my honest opinion on that. And that's me testing, let's say, a really good EQ like the SPL PQ. The plug-in is 95% there, and I've tested £1,000 EQs and they do not even come close to something like the PQ. So in my opinion, if you're not going to go for one of the high-end EQs, like a Mass Select, like a Buzz or a PQ, if you're not going to get one of these sorts of EQs, you might as well stay in the box, because the £1,000 range of EQ, £1,000, £2,000, these sorts of EQs, that's not to say the Cush Clariphonic and the Marg EQ 4M, those two are exceptional and they're under £1,000. If you're going to talk under £2,000 rather, but if you're talking about £1,000 EQs, unless you need it for like tracking purposes or something like that, and you actually need to be out the box, I would honestly say stay in the box. Use a really good emulation of top end gear, and you will generally get a better sound than a £1,000 EQ. So do spend your money on an EQ, because they're very, very important. The main things though are, when looking at an EQ, is get a dual mono one, because you will want to use that in mid-side, and it is really powerful to use in a mid-side. So if you get like an SPL PQ, you can get what I've got down here, which is the SPL Gemini. That will allow you to use the PQ in mid-side, or any other EQ actually. Now, another thing to look out for on an EQ, and some EQs, what they'll do is you'll go, let's say it goes to +10. So you've got 0 to +10. Some EQs, 0's in the middle, +10, -10. Brilliant. Other EQs go from 0 to +10, and then you have a switch to switch it from positive or negative EQ. Things like, for instance, the SPL PQ here goes from 0 to -20, 0 to -20. Whereas the Alicia Mus EQ, that goes from 0 to 15, and then you have a switch which goes from 0 to 15, is then kind of a negative EQ, subtractive EQ rather. So it's, for me, I actually prefer to be able to go 0 to whatever and 0 to -10, for instance. I like to do that. I like EQs that do that, and that is just because sometimes you might go +1 and you might want to just dial it in, and it's not always about what you're seeing. Dial it in by ear, and if for instance you get to 0, you've then got to switch a switch, and then you know you're going into subtractive EQ. So I like to have +10, -10, and I mean that's just a preference, I guess. The other thing is on an EQ like the PQ, you have basically on a lot of EQs you have a mastering version and a like a more of a mixing version. Basically, majority of the time, mastering version will be smaller increments of steps. So for instance, a mastering version is from 0 to +5, whereas the mixing version of the PQ is 0 to +20. The good thing about the PQ, and I am talking a lot about the PQ mainly because it's one of my favorite EQs, is that you've got a quarter gain switch, so you can basically switch it from mastering version to mixing version by switch a switch. That dial now, instead of going from 0 to 20, goes from 0 to 5. So those increments are smaller, which is what you want in mastering. No mastering engineer needs 20 dB of gain, increase of gain, unless something's very wrong with your room. Now, something else that's on some EQs that's it's not essential, and I don't honestly use them much, is filters. Now, the Vertigo VSE here has filters, and filters are always welcome. They're good to have, but they're not essential. So it's something to look at, but don't think of it as the one thing. Like, if it doesn't have a filter, then don't get it. That's not the case. You're never really going to use the filter, but it's good to have one. And it does mean, if you've got a kind of a filter and you can just filter off some of the lows, you can then just kind of pick out a little bit at the top. You can almost use it like a back EQ, which is always handy. The other thing with some EQs is they have what they call air. Now, you've got the Marg EQ4M, the Vertigo VSE here also has it. It's basically a kind of a range up in the top end that's like 40 hertz or something, 40 kilohertz, something up the top, really, really high, and it does make a difference. And you might think, oh well, you can't even hear that range, and no, you can't, but you can hear it when using it in EQ, because it is adding that information at the top. And if you haven't got one in your chain that does this air, you notice it, and it is something that's noticeable, and it is something that you can add in using an EQ that you wouldn't normally be able to add in anywhere else.